the axe went wrong a lot more than the sword did. They really had to push this act of attainder through to kill her. Henry had said he wanted to torture her to death with his own sword.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode on the British History Channel with me, Philippa Lacey-Bruhl. In this episode, I'm talking to Gareth Russell, historian and writer, about the downfalls of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, comparing and contrasting the events and learning about each from looking at the other. Gareth is the author of 7 books, including the best-selling Young and Damned and Fair, a biography of Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard. He studied history at Oxford and at Queen's University, Belfast, where his postgraduate dissertation was on the Queen's household in the 1540s. His most recent book, The Ship of Dreams, was named a Book of the Year by The Times and a Best History Read of 2019 by The Daily Telegraph. He was a contributor to the recent BBC series The Boleyns, A Scandalous Family, and is host of the podcast Single Malt History. He is currently working on a history of Hampton Court Palace and the people who lived there. Gareth has also delivered talks to my tour groups on Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and I'm very happy to say will be accompanying me as co-host on my tours in May and July this year. Today, I want to explore with Gareth the similarities and differences in the downfalls of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the second and fifth wives of Henry VIII, to see what we can learn about each by comparing and contrasting the events leading up to and including their executions. Members of my British History Patreon club were able to ask Gareth their own questions, which I will put to him after the main interview. You can become a patron and access the extended interview at patreon.com/British History, as well as gaining loads of History Lover benefits, including putting your own questions to future guests. First of all, I want to welcome Gareth and say a big thank you for joining me today. You've written many fabulous history books, but one in particular is pertinent to our discussion today. Young and Damned and Fair is, in many people's opinion, mine included, the biography of Catherine Howard. Now, viewers and listeners will have a chance to win a copy signed by yourself, and I will share details of how at the end of this interview. Right, so shall we begin by giving some context to what we're going to be talking about today? So in the conveyor belt that is the wives of Henry VIII, where do Anne and Catherine fit?
Well, they fit, if you ever see sort of the tourist chocolates of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, they're sold in 2 rows of 3. They're above each other. They are the middle of both rows, number 2 and 5. And in the rhyme, a lot of British school children, learn they are both of the beheadeds. Mm-hmm. So they also, along with being next to each other in the list of Henry's wives and in tragedy, as a lot of people will know, they're also first cousins. Anne's mother, Elizabeth, was the sister of Catherine's father, Edmund. So they stand close to each other in a lot of ways, but they are separated by quite a considerable gap in their dates of birth. While both are debated, Anne certainly was born at some point in the first decade of the 16th century. Catherine was born at some point, probably towards the earlier part of the first half of the third decade of the century, and that's partly because Elizabeth Boleyn married a lot younger than her brother Edmund did. Edmund didn't marry until he was in his 40s. So Anne was born to quite a young set of parents. Catherine was born to an elder set of parents, and so there was quite a significant gap. Anne probably wasn't old enough, maybe by contemporary standards, potentially actually old enough to be Catherine's mother. So depending obviously on what, there's a wide parameter of date births there, but they were united in both being Howard's, Anne on her mother's side, Catherine on her father's side, and these were two these were two women tied to an enormously wealthy and influential family. Quite interestingly, though, we tend to think of Catherine as the more high-born, but but Anne was, by contemporary standards, we tend to leave out the Irish side of the family, much to my constant irritation. There's a great deal of talking about the Boleyn side, but the Butler side, the House of Butler, who were Anne's grandmother, Margaret, was a butler. And really, if you know anything about the history of 16th century Ireland, it is hard to imagine a family with more wealth and clout and influence in the Northern European aristocracy. So Anne had two connections really to very influential aristocratic families, the Howards on her mother's side and the Butlers on her father's side. Catherine is born, yes, Edmund is a Howard. Her mother is a Culpeper by birth and a Lee by marriage. She's a widow. And these are two sort of like minor gentry families. They're not particularly significant in terms of the aristocracy. So they have similarities and differences in the aristocratic network that they're born into.
So obviously we know they're kinswomen. Actually, I mean, first cousins. With there being such an age gap, that's hard to remember, to just think about that. But so there's an age gap, but were their upbringing similar or quite different? What
they were both remarkable. I mean, this is such an interesting moment. We have to, particularly with Catherine, step away from a Victorian mindset, because really the Victorians, particularly a 19th century historian called Agnes Strickland, wrote a series on the lives of the Queens of England, and she was horrified at this idea that Catherine slept in a dormitory when she was a duke's granddaughter, and she's surrounded, she's sharing a bed with another young woman of the household. Strickland mischaracterizes all these other girls as servants when they're in fact wards. But I had quite an interesting wake-up call a few years ago when I was talking about Catherine, and a friend who specialized more in social history said that can't be right. And I said, about all the beds, the testimonies about the beds. And I said, it's right. There was a dormitory full of beds for Catherine and the other young girls in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household. And the reason why they thought it was so unusual was beds were so expensive that almost no aristocratic family sprang for them. They were left in wills and things like that. So the fact that the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, who became Catherine's guardian really in about 1531, sprang for all these beds indicates actually a very indulgent, privileged household that Catherine was sent to. Like most young people, actually, regardless of gender at the time, they were sent to, other households to learn manners. It was kind of like boarding school before its day, except that the headmaster or headmistress was a family friend or an elderly relative. The same thing happens to Anne Boleyn, but it's a much more exalted school, for want of a better word. So Catherine is sent sometime around the early 1530s to live in the admittedly palatial homes of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Anne is sent to the Habsburg court as a child, and then to the French court. So it's a much more high-pressure and highly connected version of the same childhood, really, that the other girls, including Catherine, had. But Anne has a very unusually privilege, both in terms of comfort, which Catherine's was, and in access to sort of the heart of the great monarchies of Northern Europe, which obviously was unusual by any standards. So certainly there were broad stroke similarities in the kind of households that they spent some of their formative years in. But in terms of what the actual nature of those households were, Anne certainly had access to a much more prestigious set of childhood and adolescent connections.
What sort of age were they when they went off to these?
Well, that's sort of the million-dollar question, really, in terms of the debate. Catherine seems to have been about 8 or 9 broadly speaking, which was pretty standard. Anne Boleyn's date of birth is obviously such a contested um, period moment. She could have been 8. She could have been, if you think she was born in 1507, she was 6. If you think she was born in, say, 1505, 1504, then she was 8 or 9. And if you think she's 1501, she was 11 or 12. So there's just, but I mean, broadly speaking, it is before their teenage years, they're sent.
Yeah, they're still
And
children.
foreign observers, yeah, well, foreign observers thought this was bizarre. It was unusual. It was a uniquely English custom, and it was considered. Foreigners did think it was a bit weird. Foreign visitors to England do remark on it, kind of being just they think it's odd.
Really? I didn't realize
Yeah,
that.
and it's still, by the way, it still mildly survives because a lot of people who still go to boarding school would be sent potentially at 8 or 9 is sometimes when a lot of the older, more traditional boarding schools that have maybe been around for a couple of 100 years, you can start boarding then. So there is that system does still have a certain residual influence in English culture.
It's interesting, actually. I do think the continent have always had a slightly more familial feel than we do
Yeah.
here. So do we start to see personalities of the girls at this age? You know, what do we have about what kind of where did they start? What kind of women were they in essence, do you think?
All of the Howard women have this pretty there's a lot that it just seems to run through. I was talking to other people who've written about other members of the family. They all seem to be very charming and confident. There's a certain charisma that the women of this family have that certainly Anne and Catherine both had. Anne has certain, when I was researching for another talk I gave on the history of the Butler family, it is remarkable actually when you go back how much of Anne's personality is so similar to a lot of the Butler side of the family. This sort of like Olympic gold medal capacity for holding a grudge is certainly something Anne gets, which Catherine does not have. It has to be said. Catherine can be sharp in the way Anne is. Both of them are very good at setting boundaries in terms of what they think is respectful. They don't like being talked down to. They don't like being belittled, and they are very quick to make sure that people know that. That's probably one of the traits I like the most in both of them. But Catherine, while she can be firm, even sometimes quite cutting, there's incidents with some of her servants when she's queen that doesn't show her in a great light. But Catherine gets over a grudge quickly, whereas Anne less so. Okay. But they also both, we have this idea when we only think of Tudor society as existing, with these famous people we know, we tend not to remember that they are all one percenters, to use a modern kind of nomenclature there, because Catherine and Anne both have a tendency to kind of throw money at the problem. And what I mean by that is they both have a tendency to give gifts to people who, or to hold out offers of favor in terms of political or social advancement if the person will kind of fall in line. So in that sense, you do see them as being products of elite families and of a world that had trained them to behave that way, and society did function that way. You have to judge people by their own contemporary standards. So I think there are similarities in terms of charm, charisma, and sense of self-worth, and a certain strength of character that they both have. Anne, I would argue, was not just better educated. I think she probably was more naturally intelligent. Again, the Butlers were historically interested in the arts, particularly in patronage of literature. So she has a different, and Anne grew up. Her Butler grandmother, Margaret Boleyn, was really around for most of Anne's. In fact, she actually outlived Anne. So she had that exposure growing up in a way that Catherine didn't. Neither the Lees, Culpepers, or actually the Howards were particularly interested in the arts. So Anne has a certain more, by contemporary standards, refined and distilled interest in the arts, and she does seem to have been more intelligent than Catherine in terms of intellect and those kind of things.
Interesting. So I want to move on to Anne first.
Yeah.
So summer of 1535, and Anne and Henry are enjoying their extended summer progress in Gloucestershire and Wiltshire and so on. They were feasting, they were hunting, generally having a fantastic time. But by May the next year, Anne was dead. Now, where was the turning point in Anne's story?
See, I sort of am a slight outlier on this, in that I've always felt that, I felt that always within their relationship there was the capacity for it to end this way. I don't buy this idea that it was. I mean, I have to say there are moments where I feel like I've missed something. Like I've cleared, when people are saying, it's one of history's great love affairs. I'm like, is it? Mm-hmm. In the way Titanic was like one of the great holidays. It's just, it's just a very odd way to spin this. And I do think, I personally don't buy that it was love in the way that we would understand it. And so to me, I think if you look at some of his early love letters from the 1520s, when this was all starting out, I think if you read them, it was there. The danger she stood in was there. They are very cloying. They are very mercurial from Henry. I love you so much. Why aren't you paying enough attention? I hate myself when you don't pay me enough attention. You promised you would come and then you changed your mind. There's a lot of theatrical, flamboyant self-loathing in it. He seems to hate himself for being for allowing his mood to be dependent on her responses. And so I think the relationship from him was always one of obsession with her. I think he was sort of dazzled by her, and to that, in that kind of relationship, there is poison. There is inherent poison there.
Sounds like he was blaming her from the beginning at how he was feeling as well.
See, Philippa, I kind of do lean that way, and I'm, you have to. There's obviously the Goldwater standard. You can't psychologically analyze people you don't meet, and I try. Certainly to me, there are certain things that Henry does that, scream narcissism, these kind of narcissistic rage attacks. And not just scream, like a full Broadway musical number called Narcissism. And this element to destroy what you're done with, that kind of narcissistic rage attack. But I understand absolutely that we do have to be careful with going too far and building too much on that speculation. But I do think there's something so unsettling about the dynamic between them from the start. There really is. And so I think there was an element that was really unstable and dangerous for her, probably from the get-go. What other options did she have, really? Do
you think she recognized that?
I think her reluctance when it started out was a lot more sincere. And the reason why I say that is, we are so spoiled and addled by modern transport that we think Hever is close to London. Mm-hmm. And actually, when she moved to Hever away from the court, it was not like 90 minutes on the train. It was a full day, maybe a day and a half's journey. It was not going to be easy for him to pursue her there. So actually, when she moved away to get away from his attention, I think you have to assume that at least initially she was not keen on this. But obviously I think that changed. Certainly she does seem to have completely accepted that I think it's an Italian diplomat. Yeah, he's Venetian. And he said that he was really struck by, this is the early 1530s, before she was married, by how complete and total Anne's conviction was that God had picked her. and that all of this was God's will, that she would be queen. So I think we have to also factor in the intensity of this as a providentialist society, a very pious society. And when you merge those, it's not surprising she thought that. But what, in terms of the short term, accelerated it, I think he could be very inconsistent. She's not the only person who has a moment where everything seems fine. But it happens with Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell later, where all he's given the earldom of Essex only a few weeks before his downfall begins. So that's particularly interesting in light of, as you say, this very happy tour of Gloucestershire and Wiltshire. I do think the miscarriage of January 1536, I think in terms, I know that some people think it's a more traditional narrative, but sometimes the traditional narratives are closer than we give them credit for. And I do think something snapped in him in early 1536. To me, the argument, I, by the way, should also point out, I do not believe in any way, shape or form that Henry believed she was guilty. But I think he believed she deserved to die, which is not the same thing. So I think, to sort of swing back to the narcissism point, sometimes people think, I know this person deserves something terrible, in Henry's case, that she deserves to die. And he didn't really, she didn't do what we're accusing her of, but she still deserves it. Like, I think there is an element that sort of explains, because, I mean, if it's obvious to us she didn't do it, there's no way Henry VIII's stupid enough to think it actually happened. And I say this as someone who really has to struggle to find a single good thing to say about his political capabilities. And yet even I do not think that he would have fallen for it. So I don't buy the narrative that it was really short term, that everything was fine up until, say, Easter 1536. I think things have been brewing long term from the beginning of their relationship. I think these started to dial up with Elizabeth's gender. I do think the miscarriage of 1534 and again of 1536 all starts to collide. Her quarrel with Cromwell happens at the same time. Jane Seymour's ascent begins at the same time. It's a cocktail of things, but I think from pretty much the end of January 1536, to me, Anne, I think that she hadn't realized yet, but she lost the game. That was it.
So before we get too much into the events that led to Anne's execution and downfall and execution, can we outline those surrounding Catherine first? So what's
Sure.
the first thing we see that indicates that it's all going wrong for Catherine and Henry in their relationship?
Well, this is one of those moments, or one of those discussions, and why I think this was such an interesting topic to pick, because even here there's a contrast between the two of them. You asked me when, and I was like, oh, well, here and here and here and here with Anne. With Catherine, it's the 2nd of November 1541. That's the moment. It's the Feast of All Souls, and Catherine and Henry have just returned from a lengthy tour that took up most of the summer, all of the summer, and a fair bit of the autumn into the northern counties. They've returned to the south. They're at Hampton Court Palace, and it was fairly traditional that documents, petitions, etc., would be left for the king to collect from his pew at Mass. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who'd been left behind in the south during the tour, as a sort of caretaker government for the southern shires, he, during that time, had been contacted by an evangelical pastor called John Lascelles, whose sister Mary had formerly been a servant to Catherine's family. She had started out, at the same time Catherine lived in the care of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Agnes had been a nursery maid to Catherine's cousin Agnes. She was part of a family that had supported the Reformation. But John Lascelles said to her, look, you knew her vaguely, not very well. There was quite a difference in rank between them. But she did know, she knew Catherine better than Catherine knew her. Sort of that concept of hierarchy again. But John said, she's queen, basically, why don't you go and get a place in her service now that she's queen? That will be advantageous to us. And Mary essentially said to him that Catherine's morals were so poor that there's no way that she would ever go to work for a woman like her. John Lascelles presses her and says, why are you saying this? And Mary reveals that around the time that she joined the service of Catherine's family. So I was, for the book, able to piece together that would have been after her previous employer's mission. So basically, she arrived in about the spring of 1538. And Mary relates how at that point, Catherine this affair was developing, a liaison with her music teacher, who was more on Mary's level in sort of the hierarchy of servants, a man called Henry Mannix. He turns up in records sometimes as young Mannock, but it seems generally to have been Mannix. 16th century spellings flit around quite a bit. But Mary found out that some other servants were carrying notes between Mannix and Catherine. She said to him, if anything happens between you and her, that her family will kill you. But Mannix reveals that there has been some physical intimacy between them, and that Catherine has promised that they will sleep together at some stage. Mary then tells people this. Catherine hears that Mannix has boasted. She then goes for a walk with him in the orchard and says, nope, that was not, I'm not pleased that this is being discussed. I don't want anything more to do with you. She then has a relationship with someone who is much higher than Mary and closer to Catherine's level in the hierarchy, a man called Francis Derham, who's also a ward in the household and who is the son of a wealthy Lincolnshire gentry family. And that there was talk of them maybe marrying at one stage. Now, Mary relates all of this to her brother. And in particular, it's the mention that Catherine and Francis Derham had considered getting married, because under 16th century canon law, if they had made that promise and there had been they had consummated the relationship, technically the church would regard both of them as ineligible to marry anyone else again. So the legal conundrum is that if Mary is telling her brother the truth, Catherine might not legally be entitled to be the king's wife. So Lascelles, although I would argue Lascelles, because bearing in mind he's an evangelical pastor, Lascelles to me is more concerned with what he sees as the morality aspect, because actually there's no reason to divulge the Mannix element. It doesn't have a legal component in terms of her position to be queen. But he goes to the Archbishop of Cranmer and says, this is what my sister has told me. And Henry VIII had really tightened the treason laws to something in which if you knew someone had done something that might potentially be treason or harm the king and you didn't inform the government, you were guilty with them. So this really puts Cranmer and the Archbishop in an awkward position, to put it mildly. And he's so afraid of what Henry's reaction will be that he can't bring himself to say it in person. So in the time-honored, he's sort of the equivalent of, he kind of texts to him. He can't, he writes the letter. He writes all of this in the letter and he leaves it for Henry to read. And on the 2nd of November, Henry reads it, and he brings a very small group of his most trusted advisors to his room, and he orders them to investigate what this preacher has told the Archbishop. And so some of them go to find Mannix, who is at this point still working as a music teacher and a musician in Lambeth. They find out that Francis is now working for Queen Catherine as a gentleman usher. So they bring him in for questioning. And a few of them, headed by the Earl of Southampton, they go on a hunting trip and stop conveniently at Mary Lassel's home and ask, can they have some refreshments? By the way, we heard what you said to your brother, fill us in. And Mary, and so they keep all these testimonies separate. So there's no chance they're influencing each other. And they all more or less confirm the same thing. They then go to Henry, and that starts this full investigation into her and into the Queen's private life, her detention in her apartments, then her removal to house arrest away from court. But that moment is the 2nd of November, 1541.
So already quite a telling difference between the two experiences.
Totally.
Which I'm sure we will definitely come back to and look into more in a short while. I just want to look at Henry's behaviour then here. So how is he reacting to supposed reports of Anne's misbehaviour, and then how does he react to Catherine's?
So there is one alleged report of him crying about Anne. Well, his illegitimate son, the Duke of Richmond, comes to see him, and Henry allegedly bursts into tears and says, I'm so glad that you and your sister Mary weren't poisoned by her, which interestingly is not one of the charges brought against her. So that is one outlier. If I'm not sure I believe that, but if he cried, it was not for long. He is seen, and he's seen by many people, including people in London, who start defending Anne and writing ballads in her defense, because it doesn't exactly scream grieving, wounded husband when you're seen sailing up and down the Thames on your barge, having banquets on board and playing music while your wife's in prison, which Henry does. There's also, the document is lost, but the Bishop of Carlisle has a supremely awkward moment where Henry, bear in mind, Anne has not been arrested for that long. Henry shows the Archbishop of Carlisle a full play that Henry has written about Anne's sexual misdeeds, and the bishop just does not know what to say. Who would? So Henry's taken time off from grieving to write a play about it. To write a play about it in a suspiciously short period of time. And he also, really revealingly, is engaged a day after she's executed and married by the end of the month, the same month, which does not happen with Catherine. He stays unmarried. No, he grieves for he doesn't get married again until the next year, but he grieves really quite intensely with Catherine. He's screaming at one point that he wants a sword. He's going to torture her to death himself, that he wants to see her die, that he also intervenes. He authorizes torture to be used against Francis Derham repeatedly to get more testimonies out of him that they don't really legally need. There's the suggestion, at least in court gossip, that he sanctioned torture against one of Derham's friends, a man called Robert Damport. The legend is by having his teeth pulled out one by one, although that's unverifiable. But his reaction between Anne and Catherine is night and day. They are so dissimilar to each other. And to me, the most revealing remark is he uses Anne to bully Jane Seymour. When Jane puts forward a political opinion in 1536, Henry says to her, remember what happened to the last queen who interfered who meddled in affairs of state. You don't say that if you think the crimes were adultery and incest. You don't say, by the way, be careful because remember what happened to her. He in that moment revealed that he knew she hadn't done it. So he knew Anne was innocent. I think he had this extraordinary sense of self-righteousness and certainty. So I think he fully believed she deserved to die because she disappointed him. But there is absolutely no way that you could convince me that someone like Henry VIII, who had grown up in the Tudor court his entire life, and who was intimately aware of its structures because he was the king, could possibly have believed that those that the alleged adulteries with Anne Boleyn had happened. If we can figure it out, he certainly could figure it out. If we can remember things, if we can spot she wasn't at Windsor when she was supposed to be plotting his murder, surely he would remember. There's no comparison between the reaction to Anne's fall in 1536 and Catherine's in 1541. They are completely different, and in their difference lies the detail to your answer, which is that these are two very different downfalls.
Yes, interesting. Now, the queens didn't fall from grace in isolation.
No.
There were others obviously caught up and executed both in 1536 and with Catherine in 1540. Is she executed early for 1542?
Yeah, it's actually rocking up. I just realized I'm going to have to do
you're going to have to
do she's executed on the 13th of February, 1542.
So, but they're not the only ones executed. So who else? No. Who else is involved? Who else is accused alongside them?
In Anne's case, there are 7. There are actually 7 men. 2 men are released, including the famous poet Thomas Wyatt. Although, interestingly, Wyatt is told at the time of his arrest, "Don't worry, you'll be fine," by Thomas Cromwell. So essentially, they cleverly took in 2 that they knew they were going to release, just to make it look like that the other 5 therefore were guilty. It's a shrewd, horrible move.
Yeah.
She's, of course, very infamously accused of incest with her brother George, Lord Rochford. Her other alleged lovers are Henry Norris, who is Henry VIII's confidant, a very well-liked courtier, but with pretty significant influence. Also long-standing ties to the Boleyn, to sort of being quite sympathetic to Anne. There is Francis Weston, who's a sort of dashing, athletic playboy type. He's married. That has not stopped there. He does seem to have been I don't think the wedding ring weighed Francis Weston down, although to put it mildly, although not with Queen Anne. There was William Brereton, who everyone just thought was this ludicrous choice, because William Brereton was he's not what you would call a traditionally romantic figure. No one can understand how on earth he was accused in the lists, but he was Thomas Cromwell's. He was a major rival to Thomas Cromwell and a thorn in Cromwell's side. So 2 birds with 1 stone. Mm-hmm. And then Mark Smeaton, who is the only one born outside the upper classes, could be tortured and was a palace servant, musician. So he confesses. They need a confession, so they get one out of Smeaton. And the contemporary rumor that a courtier called George Constantine reports is that he had been, quote, grievously racked to get it. And I see no reason to disbelieve that. The 5 men are beheaded on the 17th of May, 1536. Anne is beheaded on the 19th of May. So it's a 2-day gap. It's quickly done. Catherine's alleged former fiance, Francis Derham, is hanged, drawn, and quartered, which is a truly hideous death, in early December 1541, on the 10th of December. And Thomas Culpeper, again, one of Henry VIII's favourites, with whom Catherine had written a love letter and had several meetings at night after she married into the royal family, is condemned to death on the same day. He's beheaded. So they both die in December. Catherine is beheaded, as I said, on the 13th of February, and so is one of her ladies in waiting, Lady Rochford, technically Jane Boleyn, Dowager Viscountess Rochford, is beheaded for abetting the Queen's meetings, which is interesting, because for Anne to have done what she allegedly did, there would have had to have been a couple, or one, or very well organized lady in waiting who could help her, meet these men or smuggle these men in. And there is no attempt to prosecute any of the ladies in waiting. In fact, we know from a courtier called Sir Edward Bainton that they tried to get some of Anne's maids and ladies in waiting to provide false testimony against her, and they wouldn't do it. So Lady Rochford had helped set up and liaise the meetings between Queen Catherine and Thomas Culpeper. So she was beheaded for complicity in treason.
So again, more telling signs.
Well, yeah, well, of course, you need a lady in waiting to have helped you do this, and the fact that there's none says a lot.
So, what was the legal basis on which each queen was accused and convicted? What were they actually accused and convicted of?
Well, this is the really interesting thing. So to sort of start in reverse, one of them, I have to catch myself because sometimes you feel the sentence forming. She was not condemned for adultery. That is not why Catherine was executed, because that was not at that point a crime. There was legislation from the reign of King Edward III that had criminalized intercourse with a Princess of Wales or a Queen of England, because that could endanger the line of succession. But if you look at the language, it only criminalizes it on behalf of the men doing it. And it's very strongly, it looks like it's referring to, it refers to like violation. So it doesn't look like it's talking about what we would categorize, and they would have as well, as consensual adultery. Catherine is condemned, and it is made very clear in the legislation in Parliament and in the testimony of councillors afterwards. Everything is consistent on this. It is the intention to commit adultery. I've talked about the treason laws being expanded. That's what Catherine is. That is the net that catches her. Essentially, they argue your meetings with Thomas Culpeper late at night, including in her lavatory, stool, loo, bathroom in the middle of the night, they say that does not suggest pure intent. And your meetings and your gifts and the fact that the meetings were secret and at night suggest that you both intended at one point to commit adultery and to tamper with the succession. So that, but there is real legal doubt right up until the last minute if that carries the death penalty. And in fact, looking at the laws in the 1540s, they didn't. What she had done had not constituted a capital crime, a death penalty offence. And actually, there were members of the House of Lords who were very keen to say, we do not condone her behaviour, but they were not in any way comfortable with the legality, the quasi-legality. So eventually what they did was they got her on an act of attainder, and essentially they threw everything together, and Henry had the right under the treason laws to sign this or to have his signature affixed to it. And so she kind of was gotten on this melange of crimes, but they really had to push this act of attainder through to kill her, when it was not seen by most people up until the last minute that as the logical conclusion for what should happen to her. I think most people thought she'd be sort of rusticated, either into permanent house arrest or shipped off to the countryside. With Anne, the same thing stands with the adultery. It's really important. The adultery, the sexual crime element of Anne is much more clearly expressed, even though there was ironically less evidence. You have to understand the adultery, the multiple adultery, the heavy sexual component to both queens' downfall. That is still used today. If you can throw sex into a scandal, you will both titillate and horrify enough people to get them to go along with your agenda. If that is true throughout history. But the adultery, let's say for the sake of argument, Anne did it. Let's say Anne did sleep with Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton. That is not a death penalty offence. She actually can just be stripped of her titles and there were still convents then. She could have been shipped off to a convent and left there. The two crimes that she allegedly commits that mandate the death penalty are firstly the incest with Lord Rochford, and incest is a death penalty offence. The second, and it never gets talked about today because there's this debate over the adultery, is a minority of historians, maybe the adultery. No one ever talks about the equally absurd component to this, which is that they also allege that she plotted to have Henry killed, and that she hosted this sort of murder conference in her rooms at Greenwich, when actually on the entire week it happened, she was miles away at Windsor. But she has this sort of assassination convention in her apartments at Greenwich, where her, Norris, Rochford, Weston and Burton, not Smeaton, plot to kill the king. And once he's dead, she'll marry one of her paramours and rule as regent. The idea that Anne, with a 2-year-old daughter and an unborn child, would have risked having to take over the government from the king is, insane. And there is no way Henry believed it. There's no way anyone really believed it at the time. It's not discussed in the sources in the way the adultery is. The adultery is to destroy her reputation and also to potentially get rid of some of the men who might support her politically. The adultery annihilates her reputation. It's the treason and the incest, particularly the treason, that is put in to make sure she is executed.
Yeah. Wow.
So it's horrible.
There's the element of planning involved. And that's really telling difference then, isn't it, between Anne and Catherine? Yeah. The reactionary events to Catherine,
right,
and this contrived plan, arresting 2 more people than you're actually going to hold, so that you can say, no, look, obviously due process has been done because 2 of them we found weren't involved and we let them go. Yeah.
Well, Cromwell's involved with Anne. He's clever. Cromwell's dead by the time Catherine falls. But I kept wondering, was I over-egging my point in Young and Damned and Fair? But I do actually stand by it. I do think it's Henry. It is Henry's hand that pushes this. And seeing the Journal of the House of Lords, where they're sort of saying, "Oh, I'm not sure about if this is death penalty worthy," and even Chapuis and everyone thinking right up to the Emperor referring to it as a divorce, right up until the last few weeks. It is his hand. It is his vengeful hand that wants Catherine dead. And a lot of people say, really kind of identify Cromwell as the reason Anne ends up dead. But Catherine, there was as many opportunities more to let Catherine go, and she still ends up dead. The common denominator is not Cromwell. The common denominator is Henry.
Yeah. And that you had talked about the narcissism and wanting to destroy that which you have done with. It runs through.
To me, that's what stands out. To me, that seems like, and certainly I had, the most sort of, I don't know if I sort of call it a fireside and whiskey chat or a fireside and Guinness chat, but I have a friend who's a brilliant psychiatrist, and I spent so long talking. I told him all the what happened in 1536 and 1541. And he said, he's not a historian. He said this is like fireworks display narcissism. But I think to me that all that behavior does absolutely track.
It's fascinating. Well, finally, before we come on to the questions that my patrons of the British History Patreon Club have asked, I want to ask you about the final moments of both women and the differences in the treatment of them that we see. Now, famously, Anne was beheaded kneeling up, so she wasn't prostate, I always get that wrong, on the block by the Calais swordsman. Catherine was killed by the axe on the block. Why was there the difference? And actually, this is a question I've pulled out of my patrons' question because Joanne asked it, and it's pertinent to what I wanted to know. And she phrased it this way: why was Anne executed by a French swordsman, but Catherine Howard was not given that same honourable method?
Well, Joanne, great question. The honest answer is I don't know, or I don't know in precise detail why. We don't know. There are different theories. Leanda Delisle has a really interesting theory that I think she put in an article for The Spectator in 2013, where she says Anne's sword death really conjures up this like Guinevere and Camelot-esque story that Henry was so keen to cast himself in the role of King Arthur. Some people have said that, Cromwell was more organized, was a real details man, and Cromwell was around to have the swordsman pre-ordered before the trial, which just screams justice. But Cromwell had, maybe Cromwell had, ordered the swordsman, and then there wasn't someone around to do that for Catherine. There's obviously.
I mean, that's a good point, though, isn't it? The timings for the swordsman to have got.
Oh yeah, the swordsman has to have been
to England on the 19th of May. He has to have been called for before the trial.
Totally. There's absolutely no way that he could have made it to London unless he had been. I mean, we're looking at. There's no. If you look at any comparable journey, unless he had, in fact, no, it's impossible. He has to have been called before the 15th. There's obviously, again, Joanne, obviously the theory, a long-standing theory that can't be dismissed or proved one way or the other, which is that Anne had been brought up most of her education had passed in France. Catherine's hadn't. Was that why? I don't know, because my gut is that as loath as I'm not a massive Cromwell sympathizer, although I have some people who I hugely respect are. I'm sort of slightly loath to say this, but I think my gut would be maybe it is the difference is Cromwell, not being there. And the other thing is that Henry takes the logistics of the execution. Actually, now that I say this, it could be seasonal. This is going to sound ridiculous, but it would be more difficult to get someone over in winter than it would be in summer. You have to. That's another. I know we are aware of the power of nature and the weather, but we are not as openly dependent on it as they were. This is a really seasonal based society, so potentially getting someone over in February would be a lot harder than it is in May. I think it's probably a cocktail of reasons. There's also, and this is purely, again, speculative. I hope, by the way, just take all of these as equally viable, because we don't know. There isn't a set answer. But I've sometimes wondered, was there slightly more respect for Anne? You've said, Joanne, you said a more honourable method, and I think you're on to something there. Was there slightly more respect? To give Thomas Cromwell credit where credit is due, he did actually speak very respectfully about Anne after the execution. He, in conversation with the Habsburg ambassador Eustace Chapuis, he praises Anne's personality, intellect, particularly her courage. So I wonder, was that part of it? I think probably there are multiple different reasons, but
it is an interesting point, because, of course, a century later, when we see Charles I executed, they purposely use a short block as part of a humiliation, rather than the taller block, which would have left him kneeling. So it's a really interesting point.
I think so. I can't. By the way, again, this is one of those moments where you see. Sort of like the Lady of Shalot's mirror, isn't it? You sort of see the shadows darkly. You can't pinpoint with a lot of this stuff what it is. But there is, if not a paper trail, there is a trail of unanswered questions that can sometimes get you close to an answer. Certainly, Catherine is sufficiently nervous about it that she famously asks for the block to rehearse her own execution. And understandably, you have to remember, Catherine was queen when the Countess of Salisbury's execution with the axe had gone very badly indeed. She'd basically been hacked apart. Cromwell's execution had not gone smoothly either. So I do think actually Catherine was a lot more nervous, along with the honourable element of it, which is completely correct. There is also the practicality of it, which is that the axe went wrong a lot more than the sword did. So I would like to think that wasn't a factor in why it was picked for Catherine, but you don't know. Henry had said he wanted to torture her to death with his own sword months earlier. So I don't know, but I think there's probably all these reasons woven together.
Well, it's a brilliant last question to end the main part of the interview on. So before we move on to the Patreon questions, we will say goodbye to everyone else listening, and thank you very much for watching. So before we move on, thank you, Gareth, for answering all of those questions, and it's I'm really glad we did this, because I think it's a really good way of understanding it by looking at what happened to the other women, understanding each of their experiences and this story.
I think so. I mean, the answers come through the differences, I think. But I'd just like to thank everyone as well for listening to me and for this topic of conversation, because it's so fascinating. So I've very much enjoyed my time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, I do think Catherine made a lot of serious errors in judgment, but her actions before she was married, they weren't criminal. They weren't really anything. They weren't a risk until, what were the chances that she ended up saddled with someone like Henry VIII? That's what transformed the irrelevant into the terrifying, into the potentially lethal.
So much for joining me for this interview with Gareth Russell about the downfalls of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, comparing and contrasting them to learn more about each. Now, if you want to find more of Gareth, you can find his books on my Amazon shop, which is amazon.co.uk/shop/British history. He's also the writer and host of his own podcast called Single Malt History, which is on all podcast platforms. And he's on Instagram @_Gareth Russell. Now, I promised a chance for you to win according to me and many others, biography of Catherine Howard, Gareth's book Young and Damned and Fair, the life and tragedy of Catherine Howard at the court of Henry VIII. What you need to do to have a chance to win this book is answer this question in the comments. Before you do that, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and you've liked the video. The question is, who does Gareth think is responsible for the downfall of Anne Boleyn? There's only ever really been two choices, but which one does Gareth think is the culprit? So please put your answer in the comments. Make sure you've liked this video and subscribed to my channel, and get your entry in before the 31st of May. You are, of course, more than welcome to comment after that time, but your comment won't be entered into the draw for a signed copy of the book from Gareth. But what did you think of our discussion today? Did you learn anything new? Or did it make you question something you thought you understood? Or do you just disagree with some of the points? We'd really like to hear from you and know what you thought. And if you have really enjoyed this to the point where you think maybe you would like some more British history, then please think about joining my Patreon at patreon.com/British history, where you can see the extended interview with Gareth. You can also get lots of other history lover benefits and select the tier that most suits you. And you will get a chance to ask your own questions of future historians when I interview them too. You can also, as a one-off, donate via Buy Me a Coffee. You can buymeacoffee.com/Philippa if you would like to do that also. Then any donations are gratefully received, and you will receive a thank you in my newsletter and on social media. But for now, thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you again really soon. Bye.